She was laughed at, humiliated, and treated as if she didn't belong. The cleaning lady they all mocked was nothing more than a fixture to them, an invisible part of their daily lives. But what they didn't know was that this very woman owned the company they worked for, and the day they would discover the truth was fast approaching. Those who ridiculed her would soon regret their words, as she would hold their fates in her hands. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The early morning sunlight filtered through the narrow window of Grace's modest apartment. She sat in quiet reflection at her kitchen table, nursing a warm cup of coffee. From the outside, there was little remarkable about her life. She was a cleaner, after all, a janitor who worked long hours in corporate offices, keeping the spaces neat and tidy for the people who barely noticed her presence. But beneath that surface, Grace Williams held a secret. Grace wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was the owner of one of the largest cleaning companies in the city, a company that had recently acquired the very corporation where she now worked. Yet for the past 2 months, she had chosen to step into the shoes of those at the bottom of the ladder, to understand the deep-seated problems plaguing her new acquisition from the inside. She dressed in her plain blue uniform, clipping her ID badge to her shirt, and took one last look in the mirror. She had done this countless times, stepping into roles beneath her true status to understand the cracks in a company's foundation. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't just about business. It was personal. Grace grabbed her keys and headed out the door, her heart steady and determined. She was about to walk into another day of being invisible, dismissed, and disregarded. And though her job as a janitor seemed insignificant to everyone else, Grace knew that in a matter of weeks, everything would change. The corporate building where Grace worked was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, standing tall in the heart of the city. It was a symbol of success, a fortress for those who believed themselves untouchable. But what they didn't know was that their fortress was crumbling from within, and Grace was there to see it firsthand. She entered through the service entrance, just as she always did, and immediately faded into the background. As the employees rushed past her, important people with important meetings to attend, none of them spared her a second glance. She pushed her cleaning cart down the hall, her footsteps soft against the polished floors, and listened to the hum of conversation around her. It didn't take long before she overheard the first insult of the day. As Grace quietly wiped down the windows of the conference room, 2 mid-level managers strolled by, their voices filled with arrogance. One of them, a man named Tom, glanced at her briefly before turning to his colleague with a sneer. "I still don't get why we need so many cleaning staff around here," Tom said, loud enough for Grace to hear. "I mean, it's just mopping floors, right? Not exactly rocket science." His colleague Steve laughed. "Yeah, I've always thought that. These people just push brooms around and take out the trash. What's the point?" Grace kept her expression blank, her hands steady as she continued her work. She had heard comments like these before, and she had learned to let them roll off her back. But the sting of being so easily dismissed never fully went away. Growing up, Grace had always been underestimated. She was a black woman in a world where people judged her by her skin color, her gender, and her background before they ever saw her abilities. She had spent her life fighting against those judgments, building her cleaning company from nothing, and proving to herself and the world that she was more than what people saw on the surface. But for now, she had to remain unseen. She had come to this company not to be recognized, but to understand. The cracks in its foundation ran deep, and Grace needed to see the truth before she could fix it. The executives here had no idea that their futures rested in her hands. They had no clue that the cleaning lady they ignored was the one who would soon make decisions that would change everything. But Grace was patient. She would endure the insults, the arrogance, and the dismissive attitudes, because she knew that in the end, they would see her for who she truly was. As the day progressed, Grace continued her rounds, quietly observing the dynamics of the office. She noticed how the higher-ups treated the lower-level staff, how the power seemed to shift depending on who was in the room. It was the same old story she had seen in other companies, a culture where respect was reserved only for those in suits and ties, and everyone else was just background noise. But Grace was no background noise. She was the one pulling the strings, even if no one knew it yet. When the day finally came for her to reveal the truth, she would make sure they understood. The people who had humiliated her would regret ever underestimating her. And when that moment arrived, they would be the ones scrambling for their jobs, desperate to stay in her good graces. But for now, Grace would remain quiet, observing from the shadows. Her time would come soon enough. Grace continued her rounds, moving from floor to floor, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Each day, she saw the same dismissive attitudes, the same quiet arrogance from people who thought themselves superior simply because of their job titles. But she had grown used to it. Years of facing casual racism and sexism had prepared her for this. It was one of the reasons she had insisted on going undercover in the first place. She needed to see how deep the rot ran in this company before she could fix it. The truth was, Grace had come a long way from her humble beginnings. Raised in a small working-class neighborhood, she had learned from an early age that nothing would be handed to her. Her mother had worked multiple jobs to support her and her siblings, instilling in her a work ethic and determination that never wavered. Grace carried those lessons with her through her adult life, using them as fuel to build her cleaning company from the ground up. But success didn't come easily. For years, she had worked long hours, cleaning offices, homes, and businesses to save enough money to start her own operation. She had been ridiculed, talked down to, and treated as though her labor was worth less than those she served. But she had persevered, and now she stood on the other side, not just as a business owner, but as the head of a thriving empire. She had purchased this struggling corporation because she saw potential in it, a potential the executives here seemed to be blind to. As she pushed her cart into the executive suite, she overheard a conversation between two senior managers. One of them, Mark, leaned against the doorframe of his office, his arms crossed as he spoke to his colleague, Susan. "These layoffs are going to be brutal," Mark said, shaking his head. "But there's no other way. We have to cut costs if we're going to survive." Susan nodded, her expression grim. "I know, but it's always the lower-level employees who get hit the hardest. I mean, these people rely on their jobs, and we're just cutting them loose." "Well, it's business," Mark replied, shrugging. "We can't keep everyone. Some of these departments are redundant anyway. And honestly, do we really need all these janitors? We could probably outsource cleaning services and save a ton." Grace felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her head down, pretending not to hear as she wiped the windows just outside the office. Outsourcing. It was always the easy solution for people like Mark, people who didn't understand the true value of the workers who kept the company running. The janitors, the administrative staff, the people who worked behind the scenes, they were the backbone of the business. Without them, the company would collapse. But executives like Mark never saw that. To them, the people in these roles were replaceable, expendable, and that was why the company was failing. Grace finished cleaning the windows and moved down the hallway, her mind racing. The board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and it would be her first chance to see the decision-makers up close. She had already gathered enough information to know what needed to be done, but she needed to observe the meeting to confirm her suspicions. The company was on the brink of financial ruin, and layoffs were inevitable. But Grace had a different plan, one that didn't involve sacrificing the livelihoods of the workers who depended on their jobs. Later that afternoon, Grace made her way to the break room, where the atmosphere was buzzing with nervous energy. The rumors of layoffs had spread like wildfire, and the lower-level employees were on edge. Grace sat quietly in the corner, sipping her coffee as she listened to the conversations around her. "I heard they're going to cut at least 20% of the staff," one woman said, her voice tinged with fear. "I don't know what we're going to do if they let us go. I can't afford to lose this job." Another employee nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I've been hearing the same thing. And you know it's going to be us who get hit first. The janitors, the assistants. They always go after the people at the bottom." Grace felt a pang of sympathy for them. These were the people who would bear the brunt of the company's poor leadership decisions. They were the ones who worked long hours for low pay, doing the jobs no one else wanted to do. And yet they were the first to be targeted when the company needed to save money. But what the employees didn't know was that Grace was there to protect them. She had a plan to turn the company around, but it wouldn't involve layoffs. Instead, she was going to restructure the leadership and rebuild the culture from the ground up. She had done it before with other companies, and she would do it again here. But first, she needed to play her role a little longer. As the break room emptied out, Grace stood up and made her way back to the executive floor. The board meeting was fast approaching, and she had to prepare herself for what was to come. She knew that the executives wouldn't see it coming, the moment when she revealed her true identity. But when the time came, they would understand that the power they thought they held was never truly theirs. And when that moment arrived, Grace would be ready. The days leading up to the board meeting passed slowly. Grace continued her routine, cleaning offices and hearing snippets of conversations about the company's struggles. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing day, and it wasn't just among the lower-level employees. The executives, too, seemed uneasy, though they tried to hide it behind the false bravado. Grace was in the main conference room one afternoon when she overheard a conversation between the CEO, Richard Owens, and one of his closest advisors. Richard's face was pinched with frustration as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on the financial reports spread across the table. "This company is bleeding money," Richard muttered, rubbing his temples. "If we don't do something soon, we'll be bankrupt by the end of the quarter." His advisor, a tall, thin man with graying hair named Charles, nodded solemnly. "I've been going through the numbers, Richard. We'll need to cut at least 25% of the workforce to stay afloat. That's the only way to save the company." Grace's heart sank as she listened. She had suspected that layoffs were coming, but hearing the cold, calculated way they discussed cutting jobs still hit her hard. These men were so far removed from the people whose lives they were about to destroy, treating the workers as numbers on a balance sheet rather than human beings with families and responsibilities. But Grace wasn't surprised. She had seen this before in other companies, executives making decisions that protected their own interests while sacrificing the people who actually made the business run. It was the same story every time. And it was exactly why Grace had decided to go undercover in the first place. She needed to see these conversations for herself, to hear the casual indifference with which these decisions were made. After Richard and Charles finished their conversation, Grace quietly slipped out of the conference room and continued her rounds. Her mind was already formulating her next steps. The upcoming board meeting would be a pivotal moment for the company, and for her. She knew she had to be strategic in how she revealed herself. Timing was everything. Later that day, as Grace made her way through the executive suite, she passed by Mark Hastings' office. Mark had always been one of the more arrogant executives, and today was no exception. He was sitting at his desk, speaking loudly into his phone, completely oblivious to Grace's presence just outside the door. "I don't care what they say," Mark barked into the phone. "We're going to have to make cuts, and that means getting rid of the dead weight. I don't care about the janitors, the assistants, or anyone else in the lower ranks. They're all replaceable." Grace paused for a moment, her hand tightening on the handle of her cleaning cart. Replaceable. That word echoed in her mind, a word she had heard so many times throughout her life. To people like Mark, she, and people like her, were nothing more than cogs in the machine, easily discarded when no longer needed. But Mark had no idea who he was talking about. He didn't know that the woman standing just outside his office was the one who owned the company. He didn't know that the dead weight he spoke of were the very people Grace intended to protect. And soon he would learn just how wrong he had been. Grace moved on, keeping her composure as she continued her work. But inside, she was more determined than ever. The arrogance of people like Mark only fueled her resolve to make the changes this company desperately needed. She had spent her entire career fighting for people who were overlooked, underestimated, and undervalued. And she wasn't going to stop now. The following morning, the atmosphere in the office was even more tense than usual. Rumors of the upcoming board meeting had spread throughout the building, and everyone was on edge. The lower-level employees whispered anxiously about layoffs, while the executives prepared for a meeting that would determine the future of the company. Grace arrived at the office early, as she always did, and slipped into her usual routine. She made her way through the empty halls, pushing her cleaning cart quietly as the sun began to rise outside the large glass windows, the calm before the storm. As she entered one of the conference rooms to begin her morning cleaning, she paused for a moment, looking around the room. In just a few days, this room would be filled with the company's most powerful decision-makers, all of them completely unaware of what was about to happen. Grace could already picture their stunned faces, their disbelief when she revealed her true identity. It was a moment she had been preparing for, and she knew it would be worth the wait. But for now, she had to continue playing her role. The janitor, the invisible worker, the woman they all ignored. As the day wore on, the tension in the office only grew. The employees were distracted, their conversations hushed, as they speculated about the board meeting and what it would mean for their jobs. Grace overheard several of them discussing possible layoffs, their voices filled with fear. "I don't know what I'm going to do if they let us go," one woman said softly to her colleague as they passed by Grace in the hallway. "I've been here for 10 years. This job is everything to me." Grace felt a pang of sympathy for her. These were the people she had come to protect, the ones who were most vulnerable to the reckless decisions of the executives upstairs. And while she couldn't stop the fear they were feeling now, she knew that in just a few days, everything would change. Grace finished her work for the day and left the building, her thoughts focused on the days ahead. The board meeting was fast approaching, and soon the time would come for her to take control. The executives who had dismissed her, who had ridiculed her, who had treated her like she was nothing, would soon realize that the woman they had laughed at held their fates in her hands. And when that day came, they would learn a lesson they would never forget. The upcoming board meeting would be a pivotal moment for the company and for her. She knew she had to be strategic in how she revealed herself. Timing was everything. Later that day, as Grace made her way through the executive suite, she passed by Mark Hastings's office. Mark had always been one of the more arrogant executives, and today was no exception. He was sitting at his desk, speaking loudly into his phone, completely oblivious to Grace's presence just outside the door. "I don't care what they say," Mark barked into the phone. "We're going to have to make cuts, and that means getting rid of the dead weight. I don't care about the janitors, the assistants, or anyone else in the lower ranks. They're all replaceable." Grace paused for a moment, her hand tightening on the handle of her cleaning cart. Replaceable. That word echoed in her mind, a word she had heard so many times throughout her life. To people like Mark, she, and people like her, were nothing more than cogs in the machine, easily discarded when no longer needed. But Mark had no idea who he was talking about. He didn't know that the woman standing just outside his office was the one who owned the company. He didn't know that the dead weight he spoke of were the very people Grace intended to protect. And soon he would learn just how wrong he had been. Grace moved on, keeping her composure as she continued her work. But inside, she was more determined than ever. The arrogance of people like Mark only fueled her resolve to make the changes this company desperately needed. She had spent her entire career fighting for people who were overlooked, underestimated, and undervalued. And she wasn't going to stop now. The following morning, the atmosphere in the office was even more tense than usual. Rumors of the upcoming board meeting had spread throughout the building, and everyone was on edge. The lower-level employees whispered anxiously about layoffs, while the executives prepared for a meeting that would determine the future of the company. Grace arrived at the office early, as she always did, and slipped into her usual routine. She made her way through the empty halls, pushing her cleaning cart quietly as the sun began to rise outside the large glass windows. The calm before the storm. As she entered one of the conference rooms to begin her morning cleaning, she paused for a moment, looking around the room. In just a few days, this room would be filled with the company's most powerful decision-makers, all of them completely unaware of what was about to happen. Grace could already picture their stunned faces, their disbelief when she revealed her true identity. It was a moment she had been preparing for, and she knew it would be worth the wait. But for now, she had to continue playing her role. The janitor, the invisible worker, the woman they all ignored. As the day wore on, the tension in the office only grew. The employees were distracted, their conversations hushed as they speculated about the board meeting and what it would mean for their jobs. Grace overheard several of them discussing possible layoffs, their voices filled with fear. "I don't know what I'm going to do if they let us go," one woman said softly to her colleague as they passed by Grace in the hallway. "I've been here for 10 years. This job is everything to me." Grace felt a pang of sympathy for her. These were the people she had come to protect, the ones who were most vulnerable to the reckless decisions of the executives upstairs. And while she couldn't stop the fear they were feeling now, she knew that in just a few days, everything would change. Grace finished her work for the day and left the building, her thoughts focused on the days ahead. The board meeting was fast approaching, and soon the time would come for her to take control. The executives who had dismissed her, who had ridiculed her, who had treated her like she was nothing, would soon realize that the woman they had laughed at held their fates in her hands. And when that day came, they would learn a lesson they would never forget. "I think it's time we talked about a different kind of solution." Richard frowned, clearly confused by her interruption. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." Grace held her ground, her eyes locked on his. "I'm aware of that, but as the owner of this company, I think I have a right to be here." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. The executives exchanged bewildered glances, unsure if they had heard her correctly. Mark was the first to break the silence, his voice dripping with skepticism. "What are you talking about?" Mark scoffed. "You're the janitor. You don't own anything here." Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a neatly folded document, handing it to Richard. "This is proof that I've owned this company for the past few months," she said, her voice steady. "I've been here, listening, observing, and learning about how you run things. And I've seen enough." Richard's face went pale as he unfolded the document, his hands shaking as he scanned the words. The room remained deathly silent as the reality of the situation began to sink in. You've been working here as a janitor?" Richard stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace nodded. "Yes, I wanted to see for myself how things really worked around here. And now that I've seen it, I can tell you that layoffs aren't the answer. This company doesn't need to sacrifice its employees to survive. It needs better leadership." Mark stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't just walk in here and—" "I can," Grace interrupted, her voice cold and commanding. "And I will. Because as of today, I'm the one making the decisions. And the first decision I'm making is that there will be no layoffs. The room erupted into chaos, the executives scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Grace remained calm, her eyes focused on Richard, who still sat frozen in shock at the head of the table. You've been running this company into the ground, Grace continued, her voice cutting through the noise. And I'm here to turn things around. But it's not going to happen by sacrificing the people who keep this business running. We're going to do things differently. The tension in the room was palpable. The executives, still reeling from the bombshell Grace had just dropped, looked at her with a mix of confusion, disbelief, and in some cases, fear. The silence was suffocating, but Grace stood tall, her eyes scanning the faces around the table. She had waited for this moment for weeks, and now that it was here, she wasn't going to back down. Mark, still standing with his fists clenched, glared at Grace as if she had personally insulted him. This is absurd, he spat. You've been a janitor in this building for months, and now you're telling us you own the company? Do you really expect us to believe that? Grace didn't flinch. She had faced men like Mark before. Men who couldn't see beyond their own egos, who thought their power made them untouchable. But what Mark didn't realize was that he had already lost. Grace had all the power now, and it was time for him to understand that. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not, Grace replied calmly, her voice unwavering. The fact remains that I am the majority shareholder of this company. I purchased it months ago, and I've been evaluating the situation ever since. And from what I've seen, you've been making decisions that are not only reckless, but harmful to the employees who keep this place running. Richard, still pale and clearly in shock, looked up from the document Grace had handed him. His voice was weak when he finally spoke. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Grace turned her gaze to him, softening just a little. I needed to understand what was really going on here. The only way to do that was to step into the shoes of the people you've all been ignoring for years. I've been working as a janitor, seeing how your decisions affect the very people you're so quick to dismiss. And I've learned more in the last few months than I ever could have sitting in a boardroom with you. The room was dead silent again. The other executives were still too stunned to speak, their eyes darting between Grace and Richard as they tried to process the shift in power dynamics. Mark, however, wasn't finished. He crossed his arms, his expression defiant. This is insane. You can't just walk in here and start making decisions. We have a board, we have shareholders, and I am the largest shareholder, Grace interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. Which means I do have the power to make these decisions. And the first decision I'm making is to stop the layoffs. You're going to bankrupt the company, Mark shouted, his face turning red with frustration. If we don't cut costs, we'll be out of business in 6 months. Grace remained calm, her eyes locked on Mark's. What this company needs is not layoffs. What it needs is better leadership. Leadership that values its employees, invests in innovation, and focuses on long-term growth rather than short-term fixes. That's how we'll save this company, not by sacrificing the people who have worked tirelessly to keep it running. Richard finally found his voice again, though it was clear he was struggling to keep up with the rapid turn of events. But Grace, the numbers don't lie. We're hemorrhaging money. How can we turn things around without making cuts? Grace walked slowly around the table, her eyes still fixed on Richard. You've been so focused on the bottom line that you've forgotten about the people who make this company what it is. You've been trying to save money by cutting jobs, but what you should have been doing is finding ways to innovate, to make this company more efficient without sacrificing the very workforce that keeps it alive. She stopped in front of Richard, leaning slightly toward him as she spoke. We're not going to save this company by gutting it. We're going to save it by building it back up. And that starts with treating our employees with respect and dignity. That starts with recognizing that they are the backbone of this business, not just expendable assets. Richard swallowed hard, clearly unsure of how to respond. Grace could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear of losing everything he had worked for. But she also saw something else. Underneath all of his hesitation, there was a glimmer of hope. He knew she was right, even if he didn't want to admit it yet. Mark, however, wasn't ready to give up. He slammed his hands down on the table, his voice rising again. You're out of your mind. This company is sinking, and you're going to take us all down with it. We need to make cuts, and if you don't see that, then you're as delusional as... Mark, that's enough, Richard said, his voice finally regaining some authority. Mark turned to him, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're just going to let her do this? Mark demanded. She's going to ruin everything. Richard stood up slowly, his gaze shifting from Mark to Grace. He looked tired, worn down by the weight of the decision in front of him. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured. We've tried it your way, Mark, Richard said quietly. And it hasn't worked. Maybe it's time we try something different. Mark stared at him in the stunned silence, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the words. But there was nothing left to say. Grace had won, and everyone in the room knew it. Grace looked around the table, her eyes meeting those of each executive in turn. Some of them still looked uncertain, others resigned, but no one was arguing anymore. The power had shifted, and they all knew it. As of today, Grace said, her voice clear and strong, there will be no layoffs. No. Instead, we're going to restructure the leadership, invest in our employees, and find innovative solutions to the problems we're facing. This company has a future, but it's not going to be built on the backs of the people you've been so eager to cut loose. It's going to be built by all of us, working together. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. And if anyone here isn't on board with that vision, you're welcome to leave, because from now on, this company is going to be run differently. Mark stood there for a moment longer, his face twisted with anger and frustration. But eventually, he shook his head, grabbed his briefcase, and stormed out of the room without another word. The door slammed behind him, leaving the room in stunned silence once again. Grace took a deep breath, her heart still racing, but she didn't let it show. She had taken control, and now it was time to move forward. The room remained still, the tension palpable even after Mark's dramatic exit. The other executives sat in their chairs, their faces a mix of uncertainty, shock, and quiet resignation. No one dared to speak. Grace stood at the head of the table, calm and collected, though her mind was buzzing with the intensity of the moment. She had made her move, and now the future of the company was in her hands. Richard slowly sat back down, his face still pale from the sudden upheaval of power. He was visibly shaken, unsure of what to say or how to proceed. Grace could see that he was struggling to reconcile everything that had just happened. How the janitor he had never noticed was now in control of the entire company. After what felt like an eternity, Richard cleared his throat, his voice soft but steady. Grace, when he began, his eyes meeting hers across the table, what exactly is your plan? How do you intend to save this company without making the cuts we've discussed? Grace took a deep breath, her mind shifting gears. This was the moment she had been preparing for. The moment to outline her vision, to make them see that there was another way forward. She had spent weeks listening, observing, and analyzing the company's problems, and now it was time to share what she had learned. We need to stop thinking of layoffs as the only solution, Grace said, her voice firm but calm. This company is failing because of poor leadership, not because of its employees. The people who work here are your greatest asset, not your biggest expense, but you've been treating them like they're disposable, and that's why morale is low, productivity is down, and innovation has stalled. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in before continuing. We need to rebuild the culture from the ground up. That means creating an environment where people feel valued, where they have the tools and the support they need to do their best work. It also means restructuring the leadership, making sure the people at the top are actually capable of leading this company into the future. One of the executives, a woman named Sarah, who had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. But how do we do that? The company is bleeding money, and we don't have time to wait for a cultural shift. We need immediate results. Grace nodded, understanding the urgency in Sarah's question. She had anticipated this response, and she was ready for it. There are other ways to cut costs without sacrificing jobs, Grace explained. We need to look at where the waste is, inefficiencies in the supply chain, outdated technology, redundant processes. These are the things that are dragging the company down, not the employees. She continued, her voice steady and confident. We can streamline operations, invest in new technology, and find ways to make the company more efficient. That's where we'll save money. And at the same time, we need to invest in our people, train them, give them opportunities to grow, and create a culture that fosters innovation. Richard leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in thought. But how do we make that shift quickly enough to avoid financial collapse? Grace met his gaze, her voice calm but resolute. We start by getting rid of the real problem, the toxic leadership that's been making these poor decisions. We need a new leadership team, one that's aligned with the values we want to build this company on. And that starts with restructuring at the top. A ripple of unease passed through the room. The executives exchanged glances, clearly worried about what this restructuring meant for them. Grace could see the fear in their eyes, the silent question hanging in the air. Who would be next to go? Sarah, however, seemed to be warming to the idea. So you're saying we invest in the future rather than just trying to survive the present? She asked, her voice growing more confident. Exactly. Grace replied, nodding. Surviving isn't enough. If all we do is make short-term cuts, we're just prolonging the inevitable. But if we invest in the future, we give this company a real chance to thrive again. Richard sat back in his chair, his expression contemplative. He was beginning to see the wisdom in Grace's approach, though it was clear he wasn't fully convinced yet. "And what happens to us, he asked, his voice quiet but direct. "What happens to the leadership team?" Grace took a deep breath. She knew this was the hardest part, the part where the real change would begin. "Some of you will stay," she said slowly, "but others will need to go. The reality is we need leaders who are committed to this new vision, who understand the importance of investing in people and long-term growth. If you're not willing to be part of that change, then it's time to step aside." There it was. The truth was finally out in the open. The silence that followed was heavy, each executive processing the weight of Grace's words. Some looked nervous, others resigned. Sarah sat quietly, her expression thoughtful, while Richard appeared deep in contemplation. The door to the boardroom creaked open and all eyes turned toward the entrance. It was Mark, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He had clearly been waiting just outside the door, listening to the conversation. Without saying a word, he walked back to his seat, glaring at Grace as he sat down. "I'm not going anywhere," Mark said coldly, his voice dripping with defiance. "You can fire the rest of them if you want, but I've been with this company longer than you've been alive. You can't just push me out." Grace didn't blink. She had expected this kind of resistance from Mark. He was exactly the kind of leader who had been dragging the company down, someone who valued his own position and power above everything else, even at the expense of the company's success. "I'm not pushing anyone out," Grace said, her voice calm but firm. "But I am giving you a choice. You can either be part of the solution or you can leave. The decision is yours." Mark's jaw clenched, his fist tightening on the table in front of him. He was used to getting his way, and the idea that he could be replaced was clearly infuriating to him. But Grace didn't flinch. She had faced far worse in her life than a stubborn executive who refused to see reason. After a long, tense moment, Mark finally spoke. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with venom. "But I'm not going to follow your lead either. You'll regret this, Grace." Grace met his gaze, her eyes steady and unyielding. "The only thing I'll regret is not making these changes sooner." Mark stood abruptly, grabbing his briefcase and storming out of the room for the second time. The door slammed behind him, leaving the room in stunned silence once again. Grace took a deep breath, steadying herself. The hardest part was over. Mark was gone, and the path forward was clear. Now it was time to rebuild. The room remained silent after Mark's dramatic exit. The tension hung heavy in the air, but the dynamic had shifted. Grace was in control now, and everyone in the room knew it. She took a moment to let the weight of Mark's departure settle, her eyes scanning the faces of the executives who remained. They were all still processing the shock of what had just happened, how quickly the power had shifted, how the janitor they had ignored was now their boss. Grace broke the silence first. "Now that the distractions are gone, we can focus on the real work," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I know change is hard, and I understand that many of you might be feeling uncertain right now, but the reality is we can't keep doing things the way they've been done. This company needs to change, and it starts today." The remaining executives, still in a state of disbelief, slowly nodded in agreement. Sarah, who had shown signs of warming up to Grace's vision earlier, was the first to speak. "I have to admit, I didn't see any of this coming," Sarah said, her voice steady but tinged with surprise. "But I think you're right, Grace. We've been so focused on cutting costs and surviving that we've forgotten how to grow. We've forgotten about our people." Grace nodded, appreciating Sarah's willingness to acknowledge the truth. "Exactly. And if we want this company to thrive again, we need to start by taking care of our people. It's not just about saving money in the short term. It's about investing in the long-term success of this business." Richard, who had been quiet since Mark's departure, finally spoke up again. His voice was tentative, as if he was still trying to come to terms with everything that had just happened. "But what about the immediate crisis? We're still bleeding money. How do we stop that while we make these long-term changes?" Grace had anticipated this question. She knew the company was in financial trouble, and she had spent the last few weeks devising a plan to address it without resorting to layoffs. "There are ways to save money without cutting jobs," Grace explained, her tone confident. "For starters, we can restructure some of our internal processes to eliminate inefficiencies. We've been wasting resources by sticking to outdated methods and not adopting modern technologies that could streamline our operations." Richard nodded slowly, clearly intrigued. "What kind of changes are you suggesting?" We need to update our systems, Grace replied. There are new technologies that can automate many of the repetitive tasks we're currently doing manually. By doing that, we'll not only save time, but also money. And that's just the beginning. She glanced around the room, making eye contact with each executive to ensure they were following. We also need to reconsider our supplier contracts. We're paying more than we should for certain materials and services because we haven't renegotiated those deals in years. By renegotiating, we can save a significant amount of money that can be reinvested into the company. Sarah leaned forward. Her interest clearly piqued. That makes sense, but what about the leadership changes? How do we ensure that the people at the top are aligned with this new vision? Grace appreciated the directness of the question. We need leaders who believe in the importance of people, innovation, and long-term growth. I'll be working closely with the leadership team to identify who is committed to this new direction and who isn't. Those who are willing to adapt and lead with these values will stay. Those who aren't will be replaced. There was a pause as the room absorbed the weight of her words. Grace knew this was a turning point for the company, a moment that would determine whether the business could be saved or if it would continue its downward spiral. She was ready for the challenge, but she needed the team to be on board. I know this isn't going to be easy, Grace continued, but I believe we can turn this around. We have the people, we have the resources, and now we have the vision. It's time to start making the right decisions for the future of this company. Richard leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. It's a bold plan, Grace. I won't lie. It's going to be hard to pull off. But I'm starting to see that the way we've been doing things isn't working. Maybe it's time we try something new. Grace smiled softly, relieved to see that Richard was coming around. She had expected resistance, especially from someone who had been entrenched in the old ways for so long. But his willingness to consider a different path gave her hope. Good, Grace said, because we're going to need everyone on board to make this work. We're not just saving this company, we're building something better. And that starts today. The rest of the meeting was spent discussing the specifics of Grace's plan. She laid out her vision for streamlining operations, investing in new technology, and restructuring the leadership team. The executives, though still shaken by the sudden shift in power, began to engage with the ideas. Slowly but surely, they were beginning to see the potential in Grace's vision. By the time the meeting ended, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the room. The tension hadn't completely lifted, but the mood had shifted. Grace could see it in their faces. There was a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could turn things around. As the executives filed out of the boardroom, Grace stayed behind, her eyes lingering on the empty chairs. She knew there was still a long road ahead and that the real work was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she felt confident that they were heading in the right direction. Just as Grace was about to leave, Richard approached her. His expression was serious, but there was a hint of something else. Respect, perhaps, or maybe even admiration. You've given us a lot to think about today, Richard said quietly. I won't pretend I'm not still processing all of this. But I want you to know that I'm with you. I want this company to succeed, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen. Grace smiled, genuinely grateful for his support. Thank you, Richard. I know this isn't easy, but I believe we can do this. Together. Richard nodded, his face softening slightly. I believe you. As Richard turned to leave, Grace felt a surge of determination. She had taken control, laid out her vision, and begun the process of rebuilding the company. There was still much to be done, but for the first time, the path forward seemed clear. As she walked out of the boardroom and into the bustling office, Grace couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The people who had once dismissed her, the ones who had laughed at her, had no idea who she truly was. But now they were beginning to understand, and soon the entire company would know that the woman they had humiliated was the one who would save them all. The following days brought a whirlwind of changes to the company. Grace was no longer the invisible janitor who moved silently through the halls, but a force to be reckoned with. She spent her days meeting with department heads, analyzing the inefficiencies she had observed over the past few months, and rolling out her plan to restructure the leadership team. The shock of her sudden takeover had worn off, and now the real work had begun. The employees, especially those in the lower ranks, started noticing a shift. Grace made a point to visit each department personally, talking to the janitors, assistants, and support staff, people who had always been overlooked. She wanted them to know that they were no longer invisible. Their contributions mattered, and she was determined to make sure they were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. One afternoon, Grace found herself walking through the offices, her eyes taking in the familiar sights. She had spent so many weeks blending into the background, observing, learning, that it felt strange now to be walking through the same halls with a different sense of authority. As she passed the break room, she overheard a group of employees talking quietly among themselves. "Have you heard?" one of them whispered. "The janitor. Grace, she's the one who owns the company now." "No way," another replied, disbelief coloring their tone. "She was cleaning this place just last week." "Yeah, but it's true. She bought the company months ago, and now she's in charge. I heard she's already making changes, getting rid of the dead weight at the top and saving the jobs down here." Grace paused just outside the door, listening for a moment longer. A small smile tugged at her lips. Word had spread quickly, and it seemed like her efforts were already being noticed by the people who mattered most. She continued walking, feeling more determined than ever to see her plan through. As the week progressed, Grace held meetings with the key leaders who had chosen to stay. Richard had fully come around to her vision, and together they began laying the groundwork for the company's future. Sarah, too, had stepped up, eager to contribute ideas on how they could innovate and streamline processes without sacrificing the workforce. Grace appreciated the willingness of those who had remained to embrace the changes, but she knew that not everyone would be so eager. She was about to find out just how much resistance remained. One morning, as Grace sat in her newly appointed office, she received a message from HR. Mark, the executive who had stormed out of the boardroom in anger, had returned to the office and was demanding a meeting with her. Grace took a deep breath, bracing herself for the inevitable confrontation. Mark had made it clear that he wasn't going to follow her lead, and now it seemed he was ready to make good on his threats. "Send him in," Grace instructed, her voice calm and steady. A few minutes later, Mark entered the office, his face set in a scowl. He didn't bother with pleasantries or small talk. Instead, he sat down across from Grace, his eyes calm and challenging. "You've made a lot of changes around here, Grace," Mark began, his tone laced with bitterness. "I don't agree with any of them." Grace met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "I expected that, Mark. But the changes are necessary. This company was failing, and we're doing what's needed to turn it around." Mark's scowl deepened. "You think firing me was necessary? I've been with this company for over 2 decades. I know how things work around here. You're throwing away years of experience because you think you know better?" Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not throwing away anything, Mark. But your experience doesn't mean much if it's based on old ways of thinking that don't work anymore. You've been making decisions that hurt this company, and I couldn't let that continue. It's not about you, it's about what's best for the business and the people who work here." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "You think these people matter? The janitors, the assistants? They're expendable, Grace. They're lucky to have jobs at all, and you're coddling them like they're the ones running this place." Grace felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she kept her expression neutral. "They're not expendable, Mark. They're the backbone of this company, and that's exactly why we're going to succeed. Because we're going to build a business that values every single person, not just the ones in suits and ties." Mark stood abruptly, his face flushed with frustration. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know what you're doing, and you're going to run this company into the ground." Grace didn't flinch. She had faced men like Mark her entire life. Men who thought their power made them untouchable, who couldn't stand the idea of being replaced. But Grace had built her career by standing up to people like him, and she wasn't about to back down now. "I've heard that before, Mark," Grace said quietly, her voice steady. "But I'm still standing, and I'm not going anywhere. The decisions I'm making are going to save this company, whether you believe it or not." Mark stared at her for a long moment, his eyes burning with anger. But when he realized that his words weren't having the desired effect, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Grace took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair. She knew this wasn't the last time she would face resistance, but she also knew that the path forward was clear. The changes she was implementing were already starting to take effect, and while there would always be people like Mark who fought against progress, Grace was determined to keep moving forward. Later that afternoon, Grace met with Richard and Sarah to discuss the next phase of the company's restructuring. They were already seeing small improvements in morale and productivity, and the changes they had made to streamline operations were beginning to pay off. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time, they could see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. As the meeting came to a close, Richard looked at Grace, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I didn't think it was possible when all of this started," he admitted, "but I'm starting to believe we can really turn this around." Grace smiled, feeling a sense of pride in what they had accomplished so far. "We can," she said simply. "It's not going to be easy, but I know we're on the right track." Sarah nodded in agreement, her eyes bright with optimism. "It's amazing to see how much things have already changed in such a short time. People are talking about the company differently now. They're starting to believe in it again. Grace felt a surge of determination. This was exactly why she had taken on the challenge of turning the company around. Because she knew it had potential, and because she believed in the people who worked there. They had been ignored and dismissed for too long, but now they were finally being seen. As Grace left the meeting and walked through the office, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The people who had once ridiculed her were now coming to her for guidance, and the employees who had been invisible were finally being recognized for the valuable work they did. The company was changing, and it was just the beginning. And Grace knew that the best was yet to come. As the restructuring continued, Grace's vision for the company began to take shape. The atmosphere in the office had shifted noticeably. Employees who had once walked through the halls with their heads down now moved with purpose. There was a renewed sense of energy and hope, and Grace could see the positive effects of her leadership ripple through every department. One afternoon, Grace walked through the main floor, stopping to chat with some of the janitorial staff she had once worked alongside. They had heard the rumors by now that the woman who had cleaned the offices beside them was the new owner. Most of them couldn't believe it at first, but as they saw Grace moving through the building, meeting with executives and making decisions, the truth became undeniable. Grace, one of the janitors, a kind older man named Gerald, called out as she passed by, "I just wanted to say, I had no idea. You were working here with us all this time, and we didn't even know." Grace smiled, pausing to talk with him. "That was the point, Gerald. I needed to see what was really going on in this company. I couldn't have done that if everyone knew who I was." Gerald chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Well, you sure fooled us, but I have to say, it's good to know that someone like you is in charge. For a long time, it felt like no one up there even cared about what we do." Grace's expression softened, and she placed a hand on Gerald's shoulder. "That's exactly why I'm here. What you do matters, Gerald, and I'm going to make sure that everyone in this building understands that." Gerald smiled warmly, gratitude shining in his eyes. "We're lucky to have you, Grace." As Grace continued her walk through the building, she felt a deep sense of responsibility. She had come into this company with a plan, but seeing how much the employees depended on her to make things right filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about turning a company around, it was about changing lives. Back in her office, Grace sat down to review the latest reports from the leadership team. The changes she had implemented were already showing signs of progress. Productivity was up, employee morale had improved, and the cost-saving measures she had introduced were starting to stabilize the company's finances. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a strong start. As she scanned the reports, her phone buzzed. It was Richard, requesting an urgent meeting. Grace raised an eyebrow, wondering what could be so urgent. She had just spoken to him earlier that day, and everything seemed to be on track. "Send him in," she told her assistant, standing as Richard entered her office moments later. Richard's face was tense, his usual calm demeanor replaced with concern. "We've got a situation," he said, closing the door behind him. Grace gestured for him to sit. Her curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" Richard leaned forward, his voice low. "It's Mark. He's been spreading rumors around the office, trying to stir up resistance to the changes you've made. He's telling people that your plan is going to bankrupt the company, and he's encouraging some of the higher-ups to push back against your leadership." Grace's expression didn't change, but inside she felt a flicker of frustration. She had expected Mark to cause trouble, but she had hoped that his departure from the company would mark the end of his influence. Apparently, he wasn't going to go quietly. "Who's he been talking to?" Grace asked, her voice steady. "Mostly some of the mid-level managers who were close to him," Richard replied. "He's been feeding them the idea that you're going to run the company into the ground and that they need to step in before it's too late." Grace took a deep breath, considering her options. She had no intention of letting Mark undermine her work, but she also knew that confronting him head-on would only escalate the situation. She needed to handle this carefully. "Have any of the managers mentioned anything to you directly?" she asked. "Not yet," Richard said, "but I've heard whispers. I think most of them are too scared to say anything outright, but the seeds of doubt are being planted." Grace nodded, her mind racing. She knew she needed to address the situation before it got out of hand. But how? "I'll handle it," she said finally. "We can't let Mark sabotage the progress we've made. I'll call a meeting with the managers and set the record straight." Richard looked relieved. "Good. I think that's the right move. They need to hear from you directly." As Richard left the office, Grace sat back in her chair, deep in thought. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated that Mark would continue to wield influence even after leaving the company. It was a reminder that the old ways of thinking were deeply ingrained in the company's culture, and changing that wasn't going to be easy. Later that week, Grace called a meeting with the mid-level managers. As they gathered in the conference room, she could feel the unease in the air. Some of the managers looked nervous, others defiant. But Grace remained calm, her face composed as she stood at the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "I've called this meeting because I want to address some concerns that have been brought to my attention. It's come to my attention that there are rumors circulating about the changes we've been making, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page." The room was silent, the managers listening intently. Grace could see the doubt in some of their faces, the uncertainty about whether they could trust her leadership. "I know that change is difficult," Grace continued, "and I understand that some of you may be feeling uneasy about the direction we're taking. But I want to be clear about one thing. The changes we're making are necessary. This company was failing because of decisions that put short-term profit over long-term success. We're changing that, and it's going to take time." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I've heard that some of you have been told that my plan is going to bankrupt the company. That couldn't be further from the truth. We've already seen improvements in productivity, morale, and our financials. We're on the right track, and I'm confident that if we continue down this path, we'll come out stronger than ever." Grace's eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of each manager in turn. "But I can't do this alone. I need each of you to be part of this transformation. That means embracing the changes, supporting your teams, and working with me to make this company the best it can be. If anyone here isn't on board with that vision, now is the time to speak up." The room remained silent. Some of the managers exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Grace waited, giving them a chance to voice any concerns. But when no one did, she nodded. "Good," she said, her voice firm, "because we're moving forward, and together, we're going to make this company great again." As the meeting ended and the managers filed out of the room, Grace felt a sense of relief. The situation with Mark wasn't over, but she had taken the first step in addressing it. She knew that winning over the managers was crucial to the company's success, and while there were still challenges ahead, she felt confident that she could handle them. As she returned to her office, Grace reflected on how far she had come. She had started this journey as a janitor, invisible and underestimated. But now she stood at the helm of a company on the verge of transformation. There was still much work to be done, but Grace knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone stop her from building the future she envisioned. Grace felt a surge of resolve as the managers left the room. She knew that addressing the doubts was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done, and Mark's attempts to sabotage the company's progress weren't over. However, she could already sense that she had planted the seeds of trust in the leadership team. Now it was time to focus on the bigger picture. Later that afternoon, as she sat at her desk reviewing the updated reports, her assistant knocked on the door. "Grace, there's a call for you on line 1. It's from someone in the press." Grace raised an eyebrow. She hadn't expected to hear from the media this soon, but she supposed news of her taking over the company had started to spread. "Thank you," she said, picking up the phone. "Hello, this is Grace Williams." The voice on the other end of the line was direct and professional. "Ms. Williams, my name is Anna Hartley from Business Today. I've been hearing some buzz about your recent takeover of the company, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak with us for an exclusive interview. Our readers would love to know more about your journey from a cleaning staff role to owning the company." Grace hesitated for a moment. She knew that sharing her story publicly would draw more attention, but she also understood the value of controlling the narrative. If she could present her vision for the company clearly and demonstrate the strength of the changes she was making, it could help win over some of the remaining skeptics. "I appreciate the interest, Ms. Hartley," Grace replied, "and I'd be open to discussing my journey and what we're doing to turn the company around. Let's set up a time for the interview." After confirming the details, Grace hung up the phone, her mind racing. The public's perception of her leadership would be crucial in this next phase. She had always known that this moment would come, but now that it was here, she felt the weight of it more than ever. The next day, Grace met with Sarah and Richard to discuss the upcoming interview. Both of them were supportive, recognizing that it was an opportunity to solidify Grace's position as the leader who was saving the company. "This is a great chance for you to tell your story on your own terms," Sarah said, excitement in her voice. "People are going to be amazed when they hear how far you've come and what you've accomplished." Grace smiled. "It's not just about me, though. I want to make sure the focus is on the company and the people who work here. They're the reason we're turning things around." Richard nodded in agreement. "That's what makes you different, Grace. Most executives would make this all about themselves, but you've always been about the bigger picture. Grace appreciated their support, but she knew the pressure was on. The media attention would bring scrutiny, and not everyone would be rooting for her to succeed. She had to be prepared for the inevitable backlash from those who weren't ready to accept a black woman in such a powerful position. The day of the interview arrived quickly. Grace met Anna Hartley in the conference room, where the journalist had set up her recorder and notes. Anna was professional and polite, clearly eager to dive into Grace's story. "Thank you for meeting with me, Ms. Williams," Anna began, smiling warmly. "I've been following the news about your company, and I have to say, your story is nothing short of remarkable. You went from working as a cleaner in this very building to owning the entire corporation. How did you manage such an incredible journey?" Grace took a deep breath, preparing herself for the questions she knew would come. "It wasn't easy," she began, her voice steady. "I grew up in a family that didn't have much, but my mother always taught me the value of hard work and perseverance. I started my own cleaning business from scratch, working long hours and doing everything myself. Over the years, I built it up, learning everything I could about business along the way." Anna nodded, clearly being impressed. "And what brought you to this company?" Grace leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "When I first saw this company, I saw a business that had potential, but was being run into the ground by poor leadership. I knew that if I could acquire it and make the right changes, I could turn it around. But I didn't want to come in and start making decisions without understanding the people and the culture. So I decided to work as a janitor for a few months to see what was really going on behind the scenes." Anna's eyes widened in surprise. "You worked undercover as a janitor?" Grace nodded. "Yes, I wanted to understand the challenges the employees were facing, especially the ones who were being overlooked. It gave me a clear picture of the company's problems, and it also showed me how disconnected the leadership was from the people who were keeping the business running." The interview continued for another hour, with Grace sharing more about her journey, her vision for the company, and the changes she was implementing to rebuild trust and improve operations. Anna asked thoughtful questions, and Grace appreciated the opportunity to explain her approach. As the interview wrapped up, Anna smiled, clearly impressed by what she had heard. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Williams. Your story is truly inspiring, and I think our readers are going to be fascinated by what you've accomplished." Grace nodded, grateful for the chance to share her story. "Thank you for giving me the platform to tell it." When the article was published a week later, it quickly garnered attention. The headline read, "From Janitor to CEO, Grace Williams' Unlikely Journey to Corporate Power." The story highlighted not only Grace's personal journey, but also the changes she was making within the company to create a more inclusive and innovative culture. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Employees, both current and former, reached out to express their support and admiration. Many of them had no idea that the woman they had worked alongside as a janitor was now the one leading the company. But even more importantly, the public's perception of Grace as a strong, capable leader began to solidify. But not everyone was pleased. The interview had caught the attention of some of the company's former executives, including Mark, who saw it as a direct challenge to his legacy. He had been banking on Grace's failure, and now that she was being celebrated as a hero, his resentment only grew. Despite the positive press, Grace knew that the fight wasn't over. There would always be people like Mark who wanted to see her fail. But she had come too far and worked too hard to let their negativity stop her. As the weeks passed, Grace continued to focus on the task at hand, saving the company. She worked tirelessly alongside Sarah and Richard, making adjustments where needed and pushing the company toward long-term sustainability. The financial reports showed steady improvement, and employee satisfaction was at an all-time high. One evening, as Grace sat in her office reviewing the latest progress, she received an email that made her heart skip a beat. It was from the CEO of a major corporation, a competitor who had once dismissed her as insignificant. The email congratulated her on the success of the turnaround and expressed interest in a potential partnership. Grace smiled as she read the email. The very people who had once overlooked her were now recognizing her as an equal, and it was a testament to how far she had come. But more than that, it was a reminder that she was doing something right. She leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window at the city skyline. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, Grace allowed herself a moment to reflect on her journey. From janitor to CEO, it had been a long road, but she had never given up. And now she was leading a company that was on the path to greatness, one that valued its people, its integrity, and its future. In the days following the article's release, Grace became somewhat of a local celebrity. Everywhere she went, people recognized her as the woman who had defied the odds, the janitor turned CEO. Employees who had never spoken to her before now approached her with gratitude and admiration, and even executives from other companies reached out to congratulate her. But Grace didn't let the attention distract her. There was still work to be done, and she wasn't about to lose focus. The company's recovery was still in its early stages, and while they had made significant progress, there were plenty of challenges ahead. Grace knew that the journey wasn't over. One morning, she sat in her office reviewing a new batch of financial reports. The numbers looked promising. Profits were up slightly, costs were down, and the changes she and her team had implemented were starting to show results. It was a slow climb, but it was steady, and that's what mattered most. As she worked her phone buzzed with a message from Richard. He had been meeting with potential investors, and Grace was eager to hear how it went. She picked up the phone and read the text. "Investors are interested. We may have a real shot at securing additional funding. Let's meet to discuss next steps." Grace felt a surge of excitement. Securing new investors would be a game changer for the company, allowing them to expand their initiatives and invest even more in innovation and employee development. She quickly replied, setting up a meeting for later that afternoon. As she made her way to the conference room for the meeting, she thought about how far they had come. Just months ago, the company had been on the brink of collapse, with layoffs looming and morale at an all-time low. Now they were talking about growth, investment, and long-term success. It was a testament to the resilience of the people who worked there, and to the vision Grace had brought to the table. Richard and Sarah were already in the conference room when Grace arrived, both of them looking optimistic. They greeted her with smiles as she took her seat. "So how did it go?" Grace asked, leaning forward with interest. "It went well," Richard replied, his tone confident. "The investors were impressed by the changes we've made so far, and they're particularly interested in the new initiatives we've rolled out. They see potential in what we're doing, but they want to see more stability before committing to anything long-term." Sarah nodded in agreement. They're cautiously optimistic. They know the company was in a bad place not too long ago, but they're intrigued by the progress we've made. If we can show them that the growth is sustainable, we'll have a good shot at securing the funding. Grace took a deep breath, feeling a mix of excitement and pressure. It was a delicate balance, continuing to grow while proving to investors that the company was stable enough to invest in. But Grace had faith in her team, and she knew they could pull it off. "What's our next move then?" Grace asked. "We need to solidify our plans for the next quarter," Richard said, pulling out a folder with detailed projections. "The investors are looking for specific metrics, growth targets, cost reductions, and a timeline for when we expect to reach profitability. If we can give them a clear roadmap, I think they'll be willing to commit." Grace nodded, already thinking about the best approach. She had always been a strategic thinker, and now was the time to put those skills to the test. "Let's get to work then. We'll put together a comprehensive plan and make sure we hit every target. I want them to have no doubts about our ability to deliver." As they began discussing the details of the plan, Grace couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far they had come as a team. Richard and Sarah had both embraced her vision wholeheartedly, and together they had turned the company around. But there was still so much more to achieve. Later that afternoon, after the meeting had wrapped up, Grace found herself wandering the halls of the office, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She passed by the janitorial staff, who smiled and waved as she walked by. It hadn't been that long ago that she had been walking these same halls in her janitor's uniform, invisible to the very people who now greeted her with admiration. As she turned a corner, she saw Gerald, the older janitor who had always been kind to her, even when she was just another face in the crowd. He was mopping the floor, humming softly to himself, completely absorbed in his work. "Hey, Gerald," Grace called out, walking over to him with a smile. Gerald looked up, his face breaking into a wide grin when he saw her. "Grace, good to see you. How's the CEO life treating you?" Grace chuckled. "It's keeping me busy, that's for sure." Gerald nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I always knew you were something special. The way you worked, the way you listened to people. I knew you weren't just some ordinary worker." Grace smiled warmly. "Thanks, Gerald. That means a lot." They chatted for a few more minutes, talking about the changes in the company and the excitement in the air. Grace could see that the employees were starting to feel hopeful again, and that was what mattered most to her. She had always believed that a company was only as strong as the people who worked there, and seeing them thrive gave her a sense of purpose. As she walked back to her office, her thoughts turned once again to the future. The next few months would be critical for the company, and she knew there would be challenges ahead. But Grace was ready. She had faced adversity her entire life. But my name was not deep. Yeah. And every obstacle had only made her stronger. That evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing the final plans for the investor pitch, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from one of the former executives who had left the company after her takeover. "Grace," the voice on the other end said, his tone cautious. "I wasn't sure if you'd take my call, but I wanted to reach out. I've been following the news, and I think I made a mistake." Grace paused, surprised by the call. This was one of the men who had dismissed her, who had sided with Mark when she first revealed her identity. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. "Go on," Grace said, keeping her tone neutral. "I thought you were going to fail," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I didn't believe in what you were doing. But now, seeing how far the company has come, I was wrong. I'm not asking for my job back, but I wanted to apologize. I see now that you were right." Grace listened, her heart softening slightly. She had always believed in forgiveness, in giving people the chance to grow. And while this man's actions had hurt her in the past, she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you for reaching out," Grace said after a moment. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong. I appreciate it." There was a pause on the other end of the line before he spoke again. "If there's ever anything I can do to help, please don't hesitate to reach out. I believe in what you're doing now, and I'd be honored to be a part of it in any way you see fit." Grace smiled softly, her heart filled with a mix of gratitude and hope. "I'll keep that in mind. Take care." As she hung up the phone, Grace reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The people who had once laughed at her, who had dismissed her as insignificant, were now seeing her for who she truly was. And while she hadn't set out to prove them wrong, it felt good to know that they had come to understand the truth. But for Grace, the journey wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about building something meaningful, something lasting. It was about creating a company where people were valued, where their voices were heard, and where success was measured by more than just profits. And as she looked out the window at the city skyline, Grace knew that the future was bright, for the company, for the employees, and for herself. The following weeks were some of the most productive the company had seen in years. Grace's leadership had transformed not just the way the company operated, but also the way people thought about their roles within it. The changes were felt at every level. Employees, once demoralized and fearful of layoffs, now felt empowered. The culture was shifting from one of survival to one of growth, and it was clear to everyone that something special was happening. The investor pitch was fast approaching, and Grace knew that this moment could be a turning point for the company. Securing the investment would give them the financial cushion they needed to take the next big steps. New technology, expanded training programs for employees, and further innovation that could help solidify the company's future. In preparation for the pitch, Grace worked closely with Richard, Sarah, and a few key department heads. Together, they crafted a detailed presentation that would showcase not only the company's recent improvements, but also its long-term potential. Grace was confident, but she also understood the stakes. The investors were cautious, and they needed to be convinced that this turnaround was not just a flash in the pan, but something sustainable. The day of the pitch arrived, and Grace stood in front of the mirror in her office, adjusting her blazer. There was a sense of nervous anticipation in the air, but she reminded herself that she had faced far bigger challenges in her life. She had come this far by staying true to her values, and she wasn't about to lose sight of them now. Sarah knocked on the door, her face alight with excitement. "Are you ready?" she asked, stepping into the office. Grace turned to her, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "As ready as I'll ever be." Sarah nodded. "You've got this, Grace. The work you've done speaks for itself." Together, they headed to the conference room where the investors were waiting. The room was filled with executives from other companies, financial analysts, and a few familiar faces from Grace's earlier days in the business world. People who had watched her rise from humble beginnings and were now witnessing her in her element as a leader. Grace began the presentation with a brief overview of the company's history, acknowledging the challenges it had faced and the reasons for its decline. She didn't shy away from the hard truths, knowing that honesty would be key to building trust with the investors. Then, she shifted focus to the changes that had been implemented over the past few months. She highlighted the cost-saving measures, the improvements in employee morale, and the steady increase in productivity. Richard and Sarah each took turns presenting their respective departments' successes, providing detailed data to back up their claims. As the presentation went on, Grace could see the investors leaning forward. Their interest piqued. They asked questions, probing for weaknesses, but Grace had prepared for this. She answered each question with confidence, showing them that she had a clear plan for the company's future. Finally, Grace concluded the presentation with her vision for the company's long-term growth. She spoke about innovation, sustainability, and the importance of investing in people. She made it clear that this was not just about turning a profit, but about building something lasting, something meaningful. The room fell silent for a moment after Grace finished speaking. The investors exchanged glances, clearly impressed but weighing their options. Grace stood tall, her heart racing, but she remained composed. One of the lead investors, a man named Jonathan Reeves, stood up and addressed the room. "Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice measured. "It's clear that you've made significant progress, and I appreciate your transparency about the challenges the company has faced. We're intrigued by your vision, and I believe we have the potential to work together." Grace's breath caught in her chest, but she kept her expression calm. She could feel the energy in the room shift as Jonathan continued. "However," he added, "we need to be sure that the changes you've implemented are sustainable. We'll be watching your performance closely over the next quarter, and if the numbers continue to improve, we're willing to move forward with the investment." Grace nodded, understanding the caution. "I appreciate your consideration, Mr. Reeves. We're confident that the improvements we've made are just the beginning, and we're committed to building on this foundation. I look forward to continuing this conversation in the near future." With that, the meeting concluded. As the investors filed out of the room, Grace exhaled a quiet sigh of relief. It wasn't a firm yes, but it was a positive step forward, and she knew that they had made a strong impression. Richard and Sarah approached her, both of them grinning. "You did it," Sarah said, her voice full of pride. "They're interested. This is huge." "It's a great start," Grace agreed, feeling the weight lift slightly from her shoulders. "But we're not done yet. We still have to prove that we can keep this momentum going." As they walked back to Grace's office, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. They had passed a major hurdle, but the road ahead was still filled with challenges. Grace knew that securing the investment would require continued dedication, but she was ready for whatever came next. Later that evening, Grace returned to her office to catch up on some final reports. She was alone, the building mostly empty as the sun set beyond the city skyline. As she sat at her desk, reflecting on the day's events, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but the message was brief. "Grace, it's Mark. We need to talk." Grace stared at the screen for a moment, her mind racing. Mark hadn't contacted her since his dramatic departure from the company, and she had assumed he was done trying to undermine her. But now it seemed he had something else on his mind. She debated whether to respond, but curiosity got the better of her. She replied with a simple message. "What do you want, Mark?" A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. "I've been thinking about what happened. I've got an offer for you. Meet me tomorrow. You won't regret it." Grace leaned back in her chair, frowning. She wasn't sure what Mark was playing at, but whatever it was, she wasn't going to be easily swayed. Still, part of her wanted to know what he was up to. She had a feeling that Mark's attempts to sabotage her weren't quite finished, and she needed to stay ahead of whatever he had planned. She responded with one word, "Fine." As she set her phone down, Grace felt a familiar resolve settle over her. Whatever Mark had in mind, she was ready. She had come too far and worked too hard to let anyone derail the progress they had made. The next day, she would meet with Mark. But no matter what he said or did, Grace knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, stand in her way. The next morning, Grace woke up with Mark's message still lingering in her mind. She had agreed to meet with him, but she was cautious. Mark had made it clear that he wasn't going to support her leadership, and his previous attempts to undermine her had been disruptive. Whatever he had to say now, Grace knew she had to keep her guard up. She arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet, the atmosphere bustling with people starting their day. Grace spotted Mark sitting at a small table near the window. He looked more composed than she had seen him in months, but there was still a hard edge to his expression. As she approached, Mark stood to greet her, a forced smile on his face. "Grace, good to see you," he said, motioning for her to sit. Grace gave him a curt nod as she sat down, not bothering with pleasantries. "What's this about, Mark?" He took a deep breath, as if carefully choosing his words. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened over the last few months," he began, "and I'll admit I didn't handle things well. I let my ego get in the way, and I underestimated you." Grace remained silent, watching him closely. She could sense that there was more to his sudden change in tone than simple regret. "I realize now that the changes you've made, they're working," Mark continued, his voice measured. "The company's turning around, and I can see that you're committed to its future. That's why I want to propose something." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Mark leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I still have connections, important ones. There are people in this industry who trust me, who value my experience. I could help you secure new partnerships, bring in investors who would be willing to take the company to the next level." Grace narrowed her eyes. And what do you want in return, Mark? You didn't ask me to come here out of the goodness of your heart. Mark didn't flinch. I want back in, he said bluntly. I want a seat at the table. You need someone with my experience, someone who knows the ins and outs of this industry. You've done well so far, but you and I both know that taking this company to the top will require more than just hard work. It's about connections, influence, and strategy. Grace leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had expected something like this. A plea for power, for a way back into the company. Mark had always been ambitious, and his desire to regain control was transparent. I appreciate the offer, Mark, Grace said slowly. But let me be clear, I didn't turn this company around by relying on the same old strategies that got us into trouble in the first place. I did it by changing the way we operate, by focusing on the people, not just the profits. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. You think you can bring something valuable to the table? Grace continued, her voice steady. But the truth is, your approach to leadership is exactly what held this company back for so long. You saw the employees as expendable, and you made decisions that put short-term gains over long-term success. Mark leaned forward, his voice low and serious. And you really think you can succeed without playing the game, Grace? This isn't just about ideals. It's about survival. The business world is cutthroat, and if you're not willing to make tough decisions, someone else will come along and take what you've built. Grace's eyes hardened. I'm not afraid to make tough decisions, Mark, but I won't compromise my values for the sake of winning some imaginary game. This company is going to succeed because we're doing things differently. And if that means we have to fight harder, so be it. Mark stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. You think you can change the rules, but the world doesn't work that way. Eventually, you'll see that. Grace stood, her decision made. Maybe, but I'd rather build something I believe in than win by becoming the very thing I fought against. Mark didn't respond, as Grace turned and walked away, leaving him sitting alone at the table. Back at the office, Grace felt a strange mixture of relief and resolve. She had known that Mark's offer would come with strings attached, but part of her had wondered if there was a way to work together, to use his connections for the good of the company. Now she realized that his influence came at too high a cost. She couldn't let someone like Mark back into the company's leadership, not after everything they had worked to change. Later that afternoon, Grace met with Richard and Sarah to go over the latest developments with the investors. Richard had secured another meeting to present their updated financial projections, and things were looking promising. But Grace couldn't shake the conversation with Mark from her mind. Everything okay? Sarah asked, noticing the tension in Grace's face. Yeah, Grace replied, forcing a smile. I just had an interesting conversation with someone this morning. Richard raised an eyebrow. Mark? Grace nodded. He wants back in, says he can help bring in new investors, new partnerships, but it's clear he's only interested in getting his power back. Sarah shook her head. He hasn't changed, has he? No, Grace said, her voice firm. And I'm not letting him back in. He doesn't see that the way we're doing things now is what's making the difference. He thinks we have to play the same game that got us into trouble in the first place. Richard leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You made the right call, Grace. We're doing this the right way, and we don't need someone like Mark to take us backward. Grace nodded, feeling a sense of affirmation. Thanks. I just needed to hear that. Over the next few days, Grace threw herself into the work of preparing for the next investor meeting. She knew that this was a pivotal moment for the company. If they secured the additional funding, it would give them the financial security they needed to continue growing and expanding. But more than that, Grace wanted to prove that the changes they had made were sustainable. She wanted to show the world that a company built on integrity, respect, and innovation could thrive in an industry where profit margins often came at the expense of people. The day of the meeting arrived, and Grace stood in front of the investors once again. This time, she felt a sense of calm confidence. She had faced opposition, dealt with sabotage, and overcome countless obstacles, but she had never lost sight of her vision. As she presented the company's progress and laid out the future plans, Grace could see the investors nodding in approval. They asked questions, probing for weaknesses, but Grace was ready. She answered each question with clarity and conviction, demonstrating that the company's growth was not a fluke, but the result of careful planning and a commitment to long-term success. When the meeting ended, Jonathan Reeves, the lead investor, approached Grace with a smile. You've impressed us, Ms. Williams, he said, shaking her hand. We're ready to move forward with the investment. Grace smiled, a wave of relief and pride washing over her. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. We won't let you down. As she left the meeting, Grace felt a sense of triumph. The company had secured the funding it needed, and they were now poised to take the next big step forward. The future was bright, and Grace knew that they had built something special, something that would last. That evening, Grace returned to her office, taking a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. She thought about the people who had doubted her, the challenges she had faced, and the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the janitor's uniform to the CEO's office, Grace had never stopped believing in herself or in the people who had supported her along the way. She knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to savor the victory. She had fought for this company, and now, together with her team, they had brought it back from the brink, and Grace was just getting started. With the investor funding secured, the company entered a new era of growth and opportunity. Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose as she and her team rolled out the next phase of their plan. The investments allowed them to expand their operations, hire more staff, and introduce cutting-edge technology that would streamline their processes. But for Grace, the most important part was the continued emphasis on the company's culture, ensuring that the employees felt valued and empowered. One afternoon, as Grace sat in her office reviewing plans for the expansion, she received a knock at the door. It was Gerald, the janitor she had worked alongside during her undercover days. He stepped inside hesitantly, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to disturb her. "Hey, Gerald," Grace greeted him with a smile. "Come on in. What can I do for you?" Gerald shuffled his feet, clearly feeling a bit out of place in the CEO's office. "I just wanted to thank you, Grace," he said softly. "Things around here are different now. Better. People are happier, and I see how much they respect you. I don't know if you hear it often enough, but I wanted to say you've made a real difference." Grace's heart swelled with gratitude. Gerald had always been one of the kindest people in the company, and hearing those words from him meant the world to her. She stood and walked around her desk to face him directly. "Thank you, Gerald," she said sincerely. "That means a lot to me. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We're building something special here, and every single person in this company is a part of that." Gerald smiled, visibly moved by her words. "Well, I just wanted you to know that we see it. We see what you've done, and we're proud to work for you." Grace nodded, her emotions rising as she realized how much support she had from the people who mattered most, the employees who had been overlooked for so long. "I'm proud to work with you, Gerald." As Gerald left the office, Grace sat back down, feeling more determined than ever to ensure that the company's culture remained one of respect and inclusion. She had always believed that the people were the backbone of any successful business, and it was moments like this that reminded her why she had fought so hard to create that environment. A few weeks later, Grace received a call from Jonathan Reeves, the lead investor who had helped secure the funding for the company's expansion. He invited her to an industry event, a prestigious gathering of CEOs and executives from the largest corporations in the country. It was a chance for Grace to network, to connect with other leaders in the industry, and to solidify the company's reputation as a rising star. The event was held in a grand hotel downtown, the kind of place Grace had once been told she didn't belong in. But this time, as she walked through the doors, she did so with confidence. She had earned her place here, not because of who she knew, but because of what she had built. As she mingled with the other executives, Grace couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She spoke with ease about her company's success, and for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged in this world of power and influence. But even as she shook hands and exchanged pleasantries with industry leaders, Grace never lost sight of what mattered most to her: the people who had helped her along the way. During a break in the event, Jonathan approached Grace, a glass of champagne in hand. "You're making quite an impression," he said with a smile. "People are talking about your company, about the turnaround you've managed to pull off. It's impressive, Grace." "Thank you," Grace replied, her tone modest but proud. "It's been a lot of hard work, but we've built something I'm really proud of." Jonathan nodded. "And people are taking notice. You've got the investors' full support. I think this is just the beginning for you." Grace smiled, but she knew that success wasn't just about recognition. It was about staying true to her vision and continuing to fight for what she believed in. As the event went on, Grace made connections that would help the company grow even further. But she never lost sight of the people who had been with her from the start. When the event ended, Grace returned to her office, her mind buzzing with possibilities for the future. The company was expanding, their reputation was growing, and more opportunities were on the horizon. But even with all the success, Grace knew there was still work to be done. A few days later, Grace received a visit from Sarah. She had been leading one of the company's new initiatives and had some exciting news to share. Grace, we've just finished the pilot program for the Employee Development Initiative, Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. The results are incredible. The employees who participated showed a significant increase in productivity, and their satisfaction levels have skyrocketed. It's working, Grace. The people feel valued and they're thriving because of it. Grace beamed with pride. This was exactly what she had envisioned. A company where people were empowered to grow, to develop their skills, and to contribute to something bigger than themselves. That's amazing, Sarah, Grace said. Let's roll it out company-wide. This is exactly the kind of environment we've been working to create. As Sarah left the office, Grace felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The company had come a long way from the days of toxic leadership and short-sighted decision-making. They were building something sustainable, something that put people first, and the results were undeniable. Later that evening, as Grace sat at her desk reviewing the latest reports, she received an unexpected email. It was from Mark. Grace hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. She hadn't heard from him since their last conversation, and part of her wondered if he had finally let go of his attempts to regain control. But as she read the email, she was surprised by its tone. Grace, I've been watching the company's progress, and I have to admit, you've done what I didn't think was possible. You've turned it around, and it's clear that your approach is working. I know I didn't believe in your vision at the start, but I see now that you were right. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I was wrong to doubt you. Grace stared at the screen, processing Mark's words. She had never expected an apology from him, certainly not one this genuine. Part of her felt vindicated, but another part of her felt something deeper. Mark had been her adversary, but he had finally come to see the truth. And for Grace, that was enough. She replied simply, "Thank you, Mark. I appreciate your words." As she hit send, Grace felt a sense of closure. The journey had been long and difficult, but she had stayed true to herself, and now even her harshest critics were acknowledging her success. But more than that, Grace knew that the real victory was in the lives she had touched, the employees who now felt seen, heard, and valued. That night, as Grace left the office and walked through the quiet halls, she thought about how far she had come. From the janitor's closet to the CEO's office, her journey had been filled with challenges, but every step had been worth it. And now, with the company on solid ground and the future brighter than ever, Grace knew that this was just the beginning. The next few months saw the company flourish like never before. With the new funding in place, they expanded their operations, launched new products, and continued to invest in their people. Grace's vision of a company built on respect, integrity, and innovation was coming to life, and the results were undeniable. Productivity was at an all-time high, employee satisfaction was through the roof, and the company's reputation as a leader in the industry was growing. The transformation was visible in every corner of the office. Employees walked through the halls with renewed energy, no longer afraid of layoffs or neglect. They were proud to work for a company that valued them, and it showed in everything they did. The toxic culture that had once plagued the business was a distant memory, replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. One afternoon, Grace sat in her office, reflecting on how far they had come. The journey had been long, and there had been moments when she had questioned whether it was all worth it. But now, looking at the thriving company she had built, she knew that every struggle, every challenge had led her here. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Sarah, her trusted colleague and friend, who had been with her through the toughest moments of the turnaround. She entered the office with a smile on her face, holding a file in her hand. "Grace, I've got something to show you," Sarah said, her eyes twinkling with excitement. Grace gestured for her to come in, curious about what had Sarah so excited. Sarah placed the file on Grace's desk and opened it, revealing a detailed report. "These are the latest numbers," Sarah explained. "Revenue is up by 25%, employee turnover is down to its lowest in years, and we're getting offers from other companies for partnerships and collaborations. The work we've been doing, it's paying off in ways we never imagined." Grace flipped through the report, her heart swelling with pride. The numbers were staggering. The company had not only recovered from the brink of collapse, but it had also surpassed all expectations. They were thriving, and it was all because of the changes they had made. "This is incredible, Sarah," Grace said, her voice filled with emotion. "I knew we were making progress, but these numbers, they're beyond what I ever expected." And then Sarah beamed. "It's all because of your leadership, Grace. You set the tone and everyone followed. You've built something truly special here." Grace smiled, but she knew that it wasn't just about her. It was about the team, the people who had believed in her vision and worked tirelessly to bring it to life. "We've all built this together," Grace said softly, "and I couldn't have done it without people like you by my side." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with pride. "It's been an honor to be part of this journey with you, Grace." As Sarah left the office, Grace sat back in her chair, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had done what so many had said was impossible. She had taken a company that was failing, a company that had once humiliated and dismissed her, and she had turned it into something remarkable. But more than that, she had changed lives. She had created a place where people felt valued, respected, and empowered. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over the city, Grace made her way to the roof of the building. It was a quiet place, a spot where she often went when she needed to clear her mind. The cool breeze swept through her hair as she stood at the edge, looking out at the city below. She thought about the day she had first walked into the company as a janitor, invisible and underestimated. She remembered the way people had treated her, the way they had dismissed her without a second thought. But now things were different. She was no longer the janitor cleaning up after others. She was the CEO, the leader who had brought the company back from the edge and made it stronger than ever. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over her. She thought about the people who had helped her along the way. Gerald, who had always been kind to her. Sarah, who had become her most trusted ally. And even Richard, who had come around to see the value in her vision. And then there was Mark. His apology had surprised her, but it had also given her a sense of closure. She had proven herself, not just to him, but to everyone who had ever doubted her. As she stood on the rooftop, a feeling of peace settled over her. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Grace had always believed that true success wasn't just about profits or power. It was about the impact you had on the people around you. And looking at the company now, she knew that she had made a lasting impact. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "You did it, Grace. We all did it. Thank you for believing in us." Grace smiled, her heart full. She had believed in them because she knew what they were capable of. She had seen their potential, just as she had seen her own. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace turned to leave the rooftop, a sense of contentment washing over her. The company's future was bright, and so was hers. She had proven that it was possible to succeed without sacrificing your values, that you could build something meaningful by lifting others up instead of tearing them down. And as she walked back through the office, her head held high, Grace knew that this was just the beginning. The journey would continue, and she was ready for whatever came next. Because she had built more than just a company. She had built a legacy.